Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for the invite. My name is Adam Andrews. I'm the director of CenterForLit, which is a one-horse homeschool curriculum outfit in Northeast Washington, up around the Colville area. I actually used to say a one-horse outfit. It's actually a two-horse outfit now because my wife has finished the homeschooling project, having raised our 6 kids and given them a K through 12 homeschool education, and has now joined me full-time in the homeschool curriculum business. Actually, technically speaking, it's a 5-horse outfit because 3 of our kids work with us as well. So the outfit is growing slightly over the last 20 years, but still pretty small potatoes, focused on issues of reading comprehension and literature, primarily for homeschool families, homeschool parents and teachers who find themselves stuck between a particular rock and a particular hard place. And I want to describe that situation briefly before I sort of introduce myself and tell you why I come to be in this line of work. The rock and the hard place is that in a world where we sort of agree with the idea that reading is important, that reading comprehension is important, and maybe even that literature is an important aspect of a well-rounded education, we have 2 problems. One of them has to do with our children, and one of them has to do with us. And the problem that has to do with our children is, well, they're myriad, the problems that have to do with our children. Maybe there are too many of them running all around the house. And they have too many different needs all clamoring for attention at the same time. Maybe, speaking of needs, maybe our children have special needs, especially maybe when it comes to reading and reading comprehension. Maybe there is dyslexia or ADHD or a stubbornness about not liking to read and a refusal to participate in normal classroom activities with respect to reading. Just basic general recalcitrance on their part. So a lot of the problems we have, the rock that I want to talk about, has to do with our kids. The hard place has to do with us. Maybe when it was our turn to get a literary education, we shook it off. We didn't take the opportunity that we were given. Maybe we didn't have an opportunity. And when it comes to teaching this particular subject, whether it be phonics or reading comprehension or, God forbid, literature, we don't feel qualified, or we don't feel like it's a good fit for us by reason of inclination or opportunity or training or experience. And so, having admitted that it's probably important that the kids know how to read and know how to read good stuff and tell the difference between good stuff and bad stuff, we find that we're fighting an uphill battle. This is the problem that we at CenterForLit are committed to helping parents solve, and I want to talk to you in some detail about some of the solutions we've come up with in this area for the hour that we have together. But I want to begin by giving a couple of comments by way of introduction and biography so that you don't spend the first 30 minutes of the hour wondering whether to listen to me. So as I mentioned, my name is Adam Andrews, and I also mentioned that my wife works with me in our little business of CenterForLit. She is my college sweetheart. We met at Hillsdale College as freshmen in the late 1980s and got married in the spring of 1991, 4 days after graduation. So we got right into the family raising business shortly after graduating from college. And while we were in college, we were the recipients of a fine college-level literary education. And Missy in particular got an English major from Hillsdale College and was a bookworm and a book nerd from the word go. Our idea of a hot date when we were college students was sitting in a room with a couch that had a reading lamp on either end, and I would sit on one end of the couch and she'd sit on the other, and we'd read books. And the sparks just flew, you can imagine. Well, however it happened, we got married right after graduating, and then the stork began paying visits to our house. Repeated visits. Incessant visits. By the time we were married 9.5 years, we had 6 little Andrewses running around the place, growing like weeds and just waiting for us to deliver to them the kind of literary education that we had found ourselves as students at Hillsdale. Meanwhile, Missy had also begun collecting children's stories in her sort of bookworm book nerd ways, and she became an avid collector of classic children's books. So if you can picture this situation, we had in one corner of our basement a pile of children's books growing by the day as Missy found new treasures to add to her collection. And in the other corner of the basement, a pile of children, also growing by the day or by the year. And it became our job as convinced homeschool parents, which we were by this time, to find ways to connect, if you will, this pile of books with this pile of kids. To find curriculum materials, right? This is what we're all about. This is why we're here this weekend, right? Let's find great curriculum materials that will connect our kids to whom we are committed in the pursuit of education with the great ideas, with the content of their education. In the case of the Andrews, with the great books that are piling up in the left-hand corner of the basement. And the thing is that at this point we ran into trouble and discouragement and even disappointment when it comes to literature and reading comprehension curriculum. Because we found, and we're talking about, this is the early to mid-90s here, we found that the landscape of reading comprehension curriculum materials, of literature curriculum, was dominated by what I like to call the workbook approach to literature. I don't know if you know what I mean by the workbook approach, but I want to explain it briefly so you know sort of the context that I'm going to be speaking in today. The workbook approach is when you are teaching a particular great book to your kids. Let's say The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. You go to the store or to the curriculum fair or to the internet. We didn't have the internet in the early 90s, but it came along soon enough. And you find a workbook on the cover of which it says The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And you open up the workbook, and inside of this workbook, entitled Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, you find 3 kinds of exercises. The first exercise is the vocabulary list. You know what I mean, right? This is a list of words, say, from chapter 1 of Huckleberry Finn, that the reader, our student, may never have encountered before in his reading. And with each of the 10 or 12 words on this list, he is required to do 3 things. Spell it correctly, define it from a dictionary, and use it in a sentence. That's exactly right. And a grammatically correct sentence, right, with a capital letter at the beginning and a period at the end and all sorts of grammatical rectitude in between. He does that 10 or 12 times at the end of chapter 1, at which point he goes to read chapter 2 of Huckleberry Finn, turns the page in the workbook, and finds another vocabulary list. This time, words from chapter 2 of Huckleberry Finn that he may never have encountered before in his reading. And he's required to do the same 3 things with every word on that list. Spell it correctly, define it from a dictionary, use it in a sentence. He does that 10 or 12 times at the end of chapter 2. Turns the page, chapter 3, 10 or 12 words. Spell correctly, define from dictionary, use in sentence. Chapter 4, spell, define, use. Chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7. Huckleberry Finn has 43 chapters. So by the end of the workbook on Huckleberry Finn, the student has defined, spelled, and used in a sentence, hundreds and hundreds of brand new words. And his vocabulary, if he's done it well, is exploding. The vocabulary list. The second element of the workbook approach to literature is the reading comprehension question. You know this one too, right? This is a list of incomplete sentences at the end of chapter 1 of Huckleberry Finn that have blanks in them that require the student to recall factual details from the chapter and fill in the blanks. Or maybe even better, to answer a question with a complete sentence of his own that recalls factual details from the chapter, right? Who wielded the axe in chapter 1 of Huckleberry Finn? The student responds in a complete sentence with a capital letter at the beginning, then a period at the end. It was evil Mr. McGillicuddy that wielded the axe in chapter 7. Next question. 10 or 12 of those at the end of chapter 1. 10 or 12 of those at the end of chapter 2, and chapter 3, and chapter 4, and chapter 47. So by the end of the book, the student has recalled hundreds and hundreds of factual details from Huckleberry Finn. The reading comprehension question. The third element of the workbook approach is the optional enrichment project, which is where the student, in order to memorialize Huck's escape from his evil pap and faking of his own death and escaping down the river with the runaway slave Jim, is to take dowel rods and glue them together and paint them brown and make a log cabin and symbolize Huck's sojourn in the wilderness. He does that, and by the way, I'm not making total fun of this. The first time I gave this lecture, my son Aaron had just read Huckleberry Finn, and he had made a log cabin of dowel rods, and it was in our garage. So I'm guilty of the thing too. But what happens when the kid has done all these three things and finished the workbook is we say, finally, we have done Huckleberry Finn, and we can move on to the next one. At which point we go to the store or the curriculum fair or the internet and buy a new workbook with some other title on the cover. And we open it up and begin the vocab lists all over again. And Missy and I became discouraged to find that this is what is out there, because we were animated by a conviction, by a certainty that Mark Twain did not in fact write Huckleberry Finn in order to increase the vocabulary and reading level of his students. He did not say to the American public, I know you don't have a very good vocabulary now, but wait till I get done with you. Chapter 1 is going to have 10 or 12 words that you may never have encountered before, and boy, oh boy, are you going to get smart when you get done reading it. It's exactly the opposite, of course. His whole project depended upon the fact that his readers already had those 10 or 12 words. Am I right? He's using words that he assumes we can already read because he's doing something else altogether with Huckleberry Finn. He did not say when he was done, the reading level of my public is going to skyrocket. He did not say, oh, the log cabins out of dowel rods and hot glue they will build. I am so excited. No, not at all. In fact, he was after something else altogether. I don't know if you're familiar with Huckleberry Finn, but I'll tell you what it is. He wanted to have a conversation with the American public about a wide range of topics: race relations, institutionalized religion, hypocrisy, human nature in general. And he wanted to say a few things by way of conversation about those ideas and get a conversation going in the America of 1884 and 1885. That didn't have to do with increasing their vocabulary, that assumed a vocabulary and worked off a vocabulary that was already in place. And the time we spend not participating in that conversation with Mark Twain is time we spend wasted, because Huckleberry Finn was written for that other reason. And Missy and I became convinced that we were at risk of wasting a bunch of time by not pursuing this other thing. And we needed materials that would help us do it more effectively. And so, having been unable in the early 90s to find such materials, Missy ended up writing them herself. And the result was a teacher training seminar called Teaching the Classics, which is out on the table in the vendor hall, and in the guts of which approach to literature, reading and teaching literature, I want to present to you today and in some of the other talks that I'm going to give this weekend. But let me just tell you the ideas that Missy, my wife, who is here and can answer questions about this topic, lit upon and sort of weave together to create this approach. There are three basic ideas, and I want to give them to you now and then demonstrate how useful they can be. The three basic ideas of our approach to literature are these. First of all, every story in the world shares common elements with every other story in the world. Another way to say it is all stories look more or less the same in terms of shape. All stories have more or less the same structure. All stories are put together of more or less the same elements in the same order. This is an amazingly powerful idea, and I hope to be able to demonstrate some of the power of it as we go along this weekend. But I just want to emphasize it. Every collection of English words, we'll just stick with English for now. Every collection of English words that you can call a story has certain things in common that you can enumerate and list. We're going to talk about them in detail in 2 seconds. They have to do with protagonists and rising action and climax and denouement and conclusion. Every story has a plot. Every story has a setting. Every story has a conflict. Every story in the world, with no exceptions, except Goodnight Moon by Margaret Wise Brown. That is an exception. I have no idea. I cannot explain Goodnight Moon. I don't know the basis of its popularity. I don't get it. Goodnight Nobody, Goodnight Mush, it means nothing to me. So I'm stumped. But every other story has all these elements in common. Okay? That's principle number one. Principle number two, since this is true, children's stories, simple stories, short stories are the best tools that a teacher has at his or her disposal for passing on literary education to their students. Children's stories. Let me just illustrate this and maybe argue for it real quickly. What does a children's story have? Let's say A Bargain for Francis by Russell Hoban about the two badgers who can't get along. What does that story have as an advantage over Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment from a teacher's perspective, or a student's either? What does it have as an advantage? It's short. Thank you very much. You can read it in one sitting, right? Not so Crime and Punishment. Okay, what other advantage might it have? That comes from its brevity. How else is it better than Crime and Punishment? Okay, good, enjoyable, but why? Why enjoyable? Because it's clearer, right? It's understandable. Yes, it's short, it's clear. What else is true about it? Are you intimidated by A Bargain for Francis? Don't answer this question. Are you intimidated by Crime and Punishment? Nobody's intimidated by Frances. That's the whole point of Frances. You're supposed to identify with her no matter how young you are. If it's true that A Bargain for Francis is built of the same structural pieces in more or less the same arrangement as Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, which one should you use to teach literature to your student? Yes, of course, A Bargain for Francis every time. High school students who don't know anything about reading literature should be reading A Bargain for Francis so that they can learn how literature is put together. This was Missy's second great idea. If they're all built the same way, start with the easy ones. Okay? The third principle is that the best way to teach literature is to do exactly the opposite of what I'm doing to you right now. It is to have a Socratic discussion of a work of art rather than a lecture on what a work of art means and why it's important. There are some times when lecturing is necessary. Right this minute, I'm passing on an idea, a pedagogical principle to you, and the only way to really get it across is to explain it. But when we're looking together, sitting side by side, looking at a work of art, the best way to interact with that, and even to teach others to interact with it, is to ask them questions about it. Let's observe this thing together. Hey, Johnny, can you tell who the protagonist is in this story? Who's the main character who's striving after something? And what thing is he striving for anyway? How can you tell? Can you point me to the place in the story where you find that? We use the term Socratic in this third principle in a very broad and non-technical way to refer simply to teaching by asking questions rather than teaching by lecturing. And we think this is critical to not just the education and literature process, but maybe critical to literature or to education generally, the Socratic method. So these three ideas, when you combine them together, form the basis of an approach to literature that can be repeated with any book and with any student. What we've done in teaching the classics is create a step-by-step procedure by which a teacher says, okay, we're going to start the teaching the classics method with book A. Here's step one, let's go. And we walk her through the steps from beginning to end. But it's only going to work if the teacher is convinced that these three principles are true. And so what I'd like to do with you today, in the rest of the time we have together, is first of all, read A Bargain for Francis by Russell Hoban to you, and then talk to you about it, have a Socratic discussion with you about it, to see whether it does in fact share all of the structural and stylistic elements common to all works of literature, and to see whether a discussion of this simple story can bring those to light and suggest to you a technique or two for teaching literature to all students at all levels. If I can show you that A Bargain for Francis will work in this context, maybe you'll have confidence to take it to books at your students' reading level. Okay, so the rest of our time together is going to be kind of a demonstration, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions and discussion afterwards. But before we dive in, we have to be clear about what it is that all stories share. What are these common elements. And this is something that we go into in great detail in the Teaching the Classics teacher training seminar. But I want to give you a brief overview of them so that we can have a productive discussion about A Bargain for Francis. There are 5 structural elements common to every story in the world, with the Margaret Wise Brown exception that I mentioned before. And they are in all caps on our story chart here. Down at the bottom, conflict. Here at the bottom of the gray triangle, plot. In the background of the buff-colored oval, setting on the left and characters on the right. And finally, in the central white oval, theme. Setting and characters, conflict, plot, and theme. Every story has all 5 in more or less the same relation to one another. Do we know what all these are? These are pretty general terms. They're not designed to be super technical or specific. Let's just make sure we understand. What is the setting of a story? Where it happens. What else? When it happens. What else? Where it happens. When it happens. Among what kinds of people it happens. In what sort of society it happens. What are the intellectual assumptions of the world in which it happens? Whether the place where it happens is supernatural or natural. All kinds of other questions we could ask about setting, but it's the location in place and time and society where a story takes place. Okay? Obviously, the characters in a story are the people. We can get a lot more specific, though, when we talk about characters. We can say things like, who is the main character of this story? A person that we refer to, following the ancient Greeks, as the protagonist. And we can take a minute and define that term for our students. The protagonist is, what is the protagonist, by the way? Yeah, and what do we mean by that?
The person that's striving for or trying to accomplish something.
Yeah, the person in the story who's striving for a goal is the main subject of the story, right? That's the definition of protagonist. The person whose struggle or whose quest or whose journey into something that he didn't have before is the main subject of the story. In fact, we can always identify the protagonist by saying, who's got something that he needs or wants or lacks that we're preoccupied with when we read this story. Once we identify him, then we can ask this question, what does he want? What does he need? What does he lack? And then we ask a follow-up question after that. Why can't he have this thing? Is there always a reason why the protagonist doesn't have what he needs? Doesn't yet have what he's after? Isn't full of what he lacks? Of course there is. And this leads us to the third crucial common element of all stories, conflict. What is the conflict of a story? Somebody define the word for me. Yes, the problem that you, the reader, are watching to see how it will be solved, right? The problem that the protagonist is trying to solve. The problem that the author is solving for you, or the narrator is solving for you as he tells you the story, right? Does every story have a conflict? My assertion is that every story does. Can you imagine a story without one? Well, I can, because I was a junior high writing teacher once. And I once said to a class full of 8th grade girls, write me a story. It is due by next Wednesday. Go. I gave them no other rules. I gave them nothing else but a deadline. You should have seen the light come on in their eyes. They were so excited. They said, a story of my own? Wow. And they went and got reams of paper. And they went and got those pink ink pens with the glitter in it. And they were gone until next Wednesday. And they came back on the due date when the story was due, and they trooped up the front of my class down the center aisle and plopped 500 pages each of story on my desk and said, here's my story. And I realized, oh no, I have made a terrible mistake, because it is now my job to grade each and every one of these stories. I never made that mistake again. But I needn't have worried, actually, because it was very simple to mark these papers. Not least because they all said more or less the same thing. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful princess. And she lived in a beautiful kingdom, and she was the beautiful daughter of a beautiful king and his beautiful queen. And she grew up to be a beautiful young woman, the envy of all the kingdoms round about. Until one day, at the height of her beauty, a beautiful prince from a neighboring kingdom swept in on his beautiful charger, swept her up in his strong and beautiful arms, and carried her off to an even more beautiful kingdom, were that even possible, where she grew up to be a beautiful old woman and finally died of bliss. The end. Over and over and over. Incredible. Incredible. It wasn't quite that bad, and I was gentler with them than I'm letting on. But we did have a problem, right? And I could sit them down and I could say, look, your stories all have a problem. There is no problem. Nobody cares about the princess in your story, and it's nothing personal, but they're never going to care because nothing bad happens to the princess. Something bad has to happen. And then like, Mr. A, you're so cruel. No, I'm not cruel. Why is it that something bad has to happen? Why are we not interested? Yes, and why? And it repels us, doesn't it? We think this isn't real. It's not real. What are we saying when we say that? What are we saying about life in the world when we say it's not real if there's no problems? Life is hard. What is true below and beneath all things about the world? It's tribulation. The world is broken. The world is in trouble. The world is besmirched and besmudged with all kinds of things. And art, of which literature is one species, has got to reflect that in order to be good. Our students need to know this, and we can teach them by saying, every story that I'm going to let you read, you can read Margaret Wise Brown on your own time. Every story in our class is going to have a conflict in it because it's all reflective of this world we live in. The great thing about conflict, though, is that in literature, there are only 5 kinds. Did you know this? Did you know there are only 5 kinds of conflict in literature? You may know this already. What is one kind of conflict? Anybody know? Anybody ever heard the man versus man category? In some stories, the main problem is that the protagonist is fighting another guy for the same thing. And the question is, who's going to get it? Man versus man. Given that, what's another type of conflict? Man versus nature is one. Sometimes the protagonist is really, really cold or lost in the dark. Or, as in the case of Odysseus, thousands of miles from home. Right? Or a bear is trying to eat him or something. Man versus nature is a one major kind of conflict in literature. That's 2. I've said there are only 5. Can you name any of the other ones? Okay, coming of age is one category or one species of this third category.
Man versus self.
Man versus himself, yeah. Sometimes a character's immaturity, in the case of a coming of age story, or his ignorance, or his stupidity, or his lack of imagination is the main problem in the story. And him getting over that or succumbing to it is the resolution of the main conflict of the story. Man versus himself. That's 3. There are 2 more. Anybody know?
Man versus God.
Man versus God, right? And Odysseus is another great example of this, right? Poseidon hates him. This is a major problem for Odysseus. It's the reason he's not home yet. Man versus God. Sometimes the forces, the powers that be above and beyond your control are arrayed against you and there's nothing you can do. That's 4. There's 1 more. We said man versus nature already. When you're lost in the woods, can't get home, a bear's trying to eat you, that's man versus nature. Huckleberry Finn that I mentioned already in this talk is a great example of this last kind of conflict. Yes, man versus culture. We call it at CenterForLit man versus society, but yeah, that's right. When the protagonist has a way of thinking about things, he's got some assumptions in his head and in his heart that just don't line up with the expectations and the assumptions of the world around him, then he is locked in a man versus society conflict. Huck Finn thinks maybe that his friend, the runaway slave Jim, is a person, not a chunk of property. And everybody around him says, no, you're wrong. He's a chunk of property. There's a central conflict in that novel, man versus society. Here's the great thing about the fact that there are only 5 conflicts in literature. You have a 20% chance of getting it right. no matter what, right? You're 1 in 5. That's a pretty good odds. Actually, the power of this is we can say to our students, okay, good. There are 1 or more of 5 kinds of conflict moving this story forward. Which ones do you recognize? And where can you show me those conflicts in action in this story? Well, Mr. A, when Huck writes that letter and says that he'll turn Jim in, but then he can't decide to send it, that seems like a man versus society conflict there on page 147. Good job, Johnny. I think you're right. There's a man versus society conflict going on here. Not only is the fact of 5 kinds of conflict in literature make it simpler, but it also provides a opportunity for discussion and conversation, Socratic dialogue. So much for conflict. Let's talk about plot. Every story has also got plot, because plot is what? What is plot anyway? How would you define it? It's a storyline. It's the chronological sequence of events that take place in the story, right? However, we always divide the plot up into 5 stages that are also chronological for purposes of analysis and intelligent conversation, because it turns out that every plot, just like every story has a plot, every plot looks the same. I'm going to prove this to you, but in Crime and Punishment, the plot moves through exposition, rising action, climax, denouement, and conclusion, exactly the same as it does in A Bargain for Francis. Exposition, rising action, climax, denouement, conclusion. If that were true, would that be a really powerful concept? If you could take your 4th graders and say, okay, guys, I want you to notice rising action always follows exposition. Let's read A Bargain for Francis and notice how that's happening. If you do that enough times with a 4th grader and then a 5th grader, and then by the time he's a 7th grader, he's done it 1,000 times, and when he's a 9th grader, he's done it 2,000 times, you can hand him Shakespeare's Hamlet and walk away, and he will do it by himself. And you can say, how was Hamlet? He'd go, great, the rising action followed on the exposition, just like you said. I know it did, son. That's why we read A Bargain for Francis all those years ago. If I'm right, it's a really, really powerful idea. Let's talk about the stages of plot real quickly. What is the exposition of a plot, of every plot? It's the place where the author exposes to his reader the imaginary world that he has created, sets the stage, introduces some characters, maybe puts them in relationship with one another, maybe hints at a coming conflict that's going to drive the story forward. You learn in the exposition that this will be a story about 2 young female badgers trying to get along in a neighborhood, not 2 warlords fighting it out in 26th century space. Exposition. What about rising action? What is that? That's the part of every plot where a conflict pokes its head in and starts stirring the pot. And tension begins to rise in the lives of the characters, but also, importantly, in the mind of the reader about how this conflict will get resolved. That section of the story that includes rising tension because of conflict is known as rising action. It always comes to a head, this rising action, at a particular moment in the story, which we call the climax, where there is a decision made by one of the characters or an event that takes place from outside or a coming to fruition of various forces. There's a moment in the story that has the eventual result of resolving the central conflict. That moment is the climactic moment of the story. It is also identifiable because it's very often the moment of highest tension in the guts when you're reading the story. And you think, oh my goodness, this is it. This is the climax right here. I couldn't wait to turn the page and see what happened next. We link the climax with the conflict because of this important principle. A climactic moment is a climactic moment because it resolves an underlying conflict. We can always ask our students, since you think the climax happens on page 150 when Johnny throws the axe up into the air, what conflict does that resolve? What underlying problem in the story is resolved in that moment? Draw a vertical line for me, Johnny, between your idea of the climax of the story and the underlying conflict that resolves it. The connection between those 2 things will give you a really good idea of what the author's main theme actually is. Because theme the final element of the story, is the highest goal of an author. As I mentioned before, Mark Twain did not write Huckleberry Finn for vocab reasons. He wrote it for conversation reasons. He wanted to talk about something. Hypocrisy, institutionalized religion, race relations, human nature, etc. These are all themes. These are the things that we want our students to engage in, because that's what the art form is for. And the link between the climactic moment and the conflict of a story is one wide open door into discussing and understanding an author's theme. The plot also has a denouement where the tension drains out of the story. It has a conclusion where the author says, every time, by the way, the author says, hey, don't forget, this is what I'm talking about. And we can talk about those things in a little bit more depth later, but I want to jump into a way to illustrate, in particular, this link between the climax and the conflict and how it gets us involved in thinking about the theme of a story by reading that children's story to you and having a Socratic discussion about it. Okay, so I understand that this conversation has been very brief, but it's just designed as kind of an introduction to this way of thinking about literature. But let's read A Bargain for Francis together, since I promised to do it. And as I read, I want you to think about the answers that you would give to just a handful of questions. First of all, what does the protagonist want? Why can't she have it? What kind of conflict does this represent of our 5 choices? And at what moment is that conflict resolved? Okay? What's the protagonist want? Why can't she have it? What kind of conflict is this? And when is that conflict resolved? Fair enough? Okay. I have been reading this story to groups of homeschool moms since 2003. And it never gets old. I think this is one of the greatest works of American literature. It was written for 8-year-olds, but that's no matter. 8-year-olds deserve great works of literature too, don't they? A Bargain for Francis by Russell Hoban. Pictures by Lillian Hoban. It was a fine summer day. And after breakfast, Francis said, I'm going to play with Thelma. Be careful, said Mother. Why do I have to be careful, said Francis. Remember the last time, said Mother. Which time was that, said Francis. That was the time you played catch with Thelma's new boomerang, said Mother. Thelma did all the throwing, and you came home with lumps on your head. I remember that time now, said Francis. And do you remember the other time, last winter, said Mother? I remember that time too, said Francis. That was the first time there was ice on the pond. Thelma wanted to go skating. She told me to try the ice first. Who came home wet, said Mother, you or Thelma? I came home wet, said Francis. Yes, said Mother. That is why I say be careful, because when you play with Thelma, you always get the worst of it. Well, said Francis, this time I do not have to be careful. We are not playing with boomerangs. We are not skating. We are having a tea party, and we are making a mud cake. Be careful anyhow, said Mother. All right, said Francis. Francis took her dolls to Thelma's house. She took her alligator doll and her elephant doll. She took her snake doll and her teddy bear, too. As Francis walked to Thelma's house, she sang. Alligators, bears, and me are very fond of drinking tea. The elephant and the wiggly snake are happy when they eat their cake. Francis and Thelma made a mud cake. They put daisies on it for frosting. Then Thelma got out her dolls and her tea set. I'm saving up for a tea set, said Francis. I'm saving all my allowances. This is the best kind to get, said Thelma. It is plastic, and it has red flowers on it. This is not the kind I want, said Francis. I want a real china tea set with pictures on it in blue. The tea set I want has trees and birds and a Chinese house and a fence and a boat and people walking on a bridge. I used to have that kind of tea set, but all I have now is part of the teapot. The rest of it is broken. That is why that kind of tea set is no good, said Thelma. The cups break and the saucers break, and the teapot and cream pitcher and sugar bowl break, and then the set is all gone. My tea set has red flowers, and it does not break unless you step on it. Well, said Francis, I'm saving up for the other kind. How much have you saved up? Said Thelma. $2.17, said Francis. How much does the tea set cost? Said Thelma. I don't know, said Francis. I'm sure they cost a lot, said Thelma. It will take you a long time to save up all that money. I know, said Francis. And I wish I had a tea set now. Maybe I'll sell you mine, said Thelma. I don't want yours, said Francis. I want a real china one with pictures on it in blue. I don't think they make them anymore, said Thelma. I know another girl who saved up for that tea set. Her mother went to every store and could not find one. Then that girl lost some of her money and spent the rest on candy. She never got the tea set. This is what happens. A lot of girls never do get tea sets, so maybe you won't get one. Well, if I buy yours, I will have a tea set, said Francis. Yeah, you said you didn't want it, said Thelma. Anyhow, I don't want to sell it now. Why not? Said Francis. Well, said Thelma, it is a very good tea set. It is plastic that does not break. It has pretty red flowers on it. It has all the cups and saucers. It has the sugar bowl and the cream pitcher and the teapot. It is almost new, and I think it costs a lot of money. I have $2.17, said Francis. That's a lot of money. I don't know, said Thelma. If I sell you my tea set, then I won't have one anymore. We can have tea parties at my house then, said Francis, and you can use the money for a new doll. Well, maybe, said Thelma. Do you have your money with you? I'll run home for it, said Francis. All right, said Thelma. I will think about it while you run home for your money. Francis ran home for her money. When she came back, Thelma said, I will sell you my tea set. Francis gave Thelma her money. Thelma gave Francis her tea set. No backsies on this, said Thelma. All right, said Francis. No backsies. Francis went home with her tea set and her dolls, and she sang, A plastic pot can pour the tea for my dolls and friends and me, just as well as china. Red is just as good as blue. Plastic cups are all right too, just as good as china. When Frances got home, she showed the tea set to her little sister, Gloria. That is a very ugly tea set, said Gloria. What's the matter with it? Said Frances. It's ugly, said Gloria. It's a nice tea set, said Frances. It's plastic, said Gloria. It has red flowers. It's ugly. I like the china kind with pictures all in blue. You can't get that kind anymore, said Frances. They don't have them in the stores. Yes, they do, said Gloria. They have them now at the candy store. My friend Ida got one yesterday, and she showed it to Thelma. So Thelma knows they have them at the candy store. They cost $2.07. Frances walked slowly to the candy store. She looked inside, and there was Thelma. Thelma gave the storekeeper her money. The storekeeper gave Thelma a china tea set with pictures all in blue. Thelma did not see Frances as Frances walked away. Frances sang a little song as she walked away. Now that plastic's what I've got, backsies are what there is not. Mother told me to be careful, but Thelma better be wareful. Frances thought about no backsies all the way home. When she got home, she put a penny in the plastic sugar bowl of her tea set. Then she called Thelma on the telephone. Hello, said Thelma. Hello, said Frances. This is Frances. Remember, said Thelma, no backsies. I remember, said Frances, but are you sure you really want no backsies? Sure, I'm sure, said Thelma. You mean I never have to give back the tea set, said Frances. That's right, said Thelma. You can keep the tea set. Can I keep what is in the sugar bowl too, said Frances. What's in the sugar bowl, said Thelma. Never mind, said Frances. No backsies. Goodbye. And Frances hung up. Frances waited for the telephone to ring, and when it rang, she said, Hello. Hello, said Thelma. This is Thelma. I know, said Frances. I just remembered, said Thelma. I think I had something in the sugar bowl. I think it was a ring. Did you find a ring? No, said Frances. And I don't have to tell you what is in the sugar bowl, because you said no backsies. Well, said Thelma, I just remembered that I put some money in the sugar bowl one time. I think it was some birthday money. I think it was $2, or maybe it was $5. Did you find money? Well, you said no backsies, said Francis, so I don't have to tell you. I don't have to say how much money is in the sugar bowl. Well, said Thelma, it is my money and I want it. Do you want backsies? Said Francis. Do you want your tea set back and you will give my money back? I can't, said Thelma, because I used the new money for a new tea set. There's only a dime left over. I will give you the new tea set and the dime. The new tea set is the china kind you want. It has pictures all in blue. But you said they don't make that kind anymore, said Francis. Well, this one was very hard to find, said Thelma, and I think it was the very last one in the store. All right, said Francis. Bring it over. Thelma brought over the china tea set and the dime, and Francis gave back the plastic tea set. Then Thelma took the lid off the sugar bowl and saw the penny. That is not a very nice trick to play on a friend, said Thelma. No, said Francis, it is not. And that was not a nice trick you played on me when you sold me your tea set. Well, said Thelma, from now on, I will have to be careful when I play with you. Being careful is not as much fun as being friends, said Francis. Do you want to be careful or do you want to be friends? I want to be friends, said Thelma. All right, said Francis, then I'll give you halfies on the dime. Francis and Thelma went to the candy store with the dime. Francis bought bubble gum and Thelma bought lifesavers. Then they went back to Francis's house to skip rope. Gloria came out to turn the rope and skip, too. You and Gloria can skip first, said Francis to Thelma. I will go last. Thelma skipped first, then Gloria, then Francis skipped, and she sang. 1 for plastic, 2 for china, 3 for yours and 4 for mine, 5 for tea and 6 for cakes, 7 for elephants, 8 for snakes, 9's a trip to the candy store, then comes 10 and 10 skips more. Backsies 1, backsies 2, backsies are no fun to do. Careful once, careful twice, being careful isn't nice. Being friends is better. Then Francis and Thelma shared their bubblegum and lifesavers with Gloria. The end. The classics, huh? Don't you love it? Little Russell Hoban to roll around on your tongue before you go to bed at night. Good for the soul. Let me ask you a few questions about the structural elements of this story. Ask the questions that I asked before I started reading, and let's see if we can't get our minds around the idea that this is Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky for second graders. This is Shakespeare's Hamlet for kindergartners. That teaching kids how to read this story properly and recognizing its elements is preparing them for a lifetime of reading the great books. And you can start right now. That'll work only if we can see these elements working together in the same way that they do in adult literature. So let me ask you the question. What does the protagonist want? Imagine that you're 5 years old or a second grader. What would you say? What does Frances want? She wants a china tea set. Of course she does. She wants a china tea set with pictures all in blue. Now think carefully, why can't she have it? She doesn't have enough money is the first answer. Is this actually true? No, it's not. She has enough money with 10 cents left over, right? She has plenty of money, so that's not it. Why can't she have the tea set? Because she's been deceived about its availability, right? By whom? By Thelma. So who is the antagonist in the story? If the story is about the tea set, it's Thelma, right? What kind of conflict is this? That's question number 3. What's the protagonist want? Why can't she have it? What kind of conflict is that? This is man versus man. Badger versus badger, if you prefer. Right? This is a badger versus badger conflict. The question being, who will get the tea set? Right? Okay, now think over the events of the story. At what point in the story's action does something take place that resolves, that answers this question? Or another way to put it is, since you've read the whole story from beginning to end, when do we know that Frances is going to get the tea set? When does the action turn? By the way, I'm asking as a point of discussion. I want to hear what you think, and let's talk about it. Now, we're at a disadvantage because you don't have the story in front of you, but it wasn't a long or particularly complicated story either. So cast your mind back. At what point do we know?
When she put the penny in.
Okay, when Frances puts a penny in the plastic sugar bowl of the tea set. Now, does she have the right tea set at that point? She does not. What makes you think that that's the climactic moment? How does that turn the action? What do we know at that point?
Because at that point, she knows that the other tea set is available. She knows Thelma has it. And you know that that penny action somehow, you don't know how she's going to do it at that point, but you know that she has something in mind.
You know she's got something in mind, right? You know she's got a plan and that she's executing the plan. And so what happens after she puts the penny in the tea set, you could argue, is sort of a chain reaction foregone conclusion. She sets things in motion at that point that eventually result in the resolution of the conflict. Yeah? Okay, good. You could argue that. Anybody have another idea of when the climactic moment of the tea set story is?
I think it's when Frances sees Thelma buying the tea set. Oh, I have been deceived.
Ah.
I should have gotten it myself.
Now this is dang it, yeah. This is a very important turning point. In order to talk about this one, I want to ask the question again. What does Frances want? And I want you to give me a different answer than she wants a tea set. Because is it true that she wants more than one thing?
She wants to be friends with her.
Okay, she wants something about some kind of friendship with Thelma that she doesn't have at the beginning of the story, right? Right. What kind of friendship does she have with Thelma at the beginning of the story? How is it characterized? What evidence do we have that it's bad? Her mother tells her to be careful. We have a back history, right? We've got the boomerang thing. We've got the thin ice thing, right? Thelma's not to be trusted. And Frances wants a good friendship with Thelma. What else does Frances want? In this connection, it's really interesting sometimes to use the term want not only as a synonym for desire, but also as a synonym for lack, sort of in the biblical sense. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. What does Frances want in that sense? What does she lack in the early pages of this story?
Awareness.
Okay, awareness. How would you describe Frances on page 1 of the story? Ignorant. Give me some other adjectives that would describe her. Naive. Trusting, maybe overly trusting to the point of gullible, right? She's ignorant, she's naive, she's gullible, she's trusting, she's immature, maybe? Really, really super duper young and green, right? What does she lack? What does she want in the biblical sense? Wisdom, experience, exactly right. She wants a little growing up, right? She needs to become a little bit more worldly wise in order to get along in this cruel badger world. Yes? Okay, so we've isolated at least 3 different things that this protagonist wants in the various senses of the term. She wants a tea set. She wants / lacks a little maturity, some wisdom, some experience, and she wants a particular kind of friendship with Thelma. Are those the same thing? Those are 3 completely distinct stories, aren't they? If they had 3 distinct climactic moments, it would actually make that point pretty strongly, wouldn't it? If Russell Hoban could actually, in telling the story of Frances and Thelma, be telling 3 stories at once, that would be a nice trick. And it would argue pretty well, for my case, that Frances is a good proving ground, a practicing ground for reading Dostoevsky and Shakespeare later. Yes? Okay, I would argue that the tea set conflict has its climactic moment at some point during the place when Frances is putting her plan into action. Some people like to argue that it's when Thelma calls back on the telephone and says, "Hello, this is Thelma." And Frances goes, "I know exactly who this is because I set this whole thing up and you are now playing by my rules. Congratulations, I win." At that point, we know it's going to go Frances's way. She's going to get whatever she wants. But let's think about the issue of maturity, the issue of growing up and experience. That climactic moment, the climactic moment of that story is in a different place, isn't it? When do we know that naive Frances has permanently retired and worldly wise Frances has taken her place? Well, or maybe even before that, when she turns away from the candy store window, like you said, and sings a voice, or sings that song in another tone of voice, right? Thelma better be careful, because old Francis is dead, and new Francis is now driving the Badger bus, and you all better watch out, right? There's been a change that has taken place in Francis that never goes back. It's a permanent change from that moment forward, right? At the candy store window, there's a turning point in the story with respect to this maturity conflict, this man versus self coming of age, growing up conflict. So far we have two conflicts, two separate climactic moments. What about that last one that you mentioned over here? What does Frances want? She wants friendship with Thelma based on honesty and trust and taking care of one another, for goodness sakes. Does that story question have a third distinct, separate, climactic moment?
I feel like it's when Francis asks, do you want friends or do you want to be careful?
Being careful, Francis says, is not as much fun as being friends. What's it going to be, Thelma, now that I have beaten you in a battle of wits and brought you back to the bargaining table and my foot is, rhetorically speaking, on your neck? Do you want to be careful or do you want to be friends? And you can feel the Russell Hoban telling us to wait with bated breath while we turn the page. We don't even know what the answer is going to be till we turn the page, right? And we find that Thelma says, forget it. I want to be friends. Let's bury the hatchet and go to the candy store and buy bubble gum, right? And what happens after this moment in terms of tension in the story? They went to the candy store with the dime. Francis bought bubblegum, Thelma bought lifesavers. Gloria came out to turn the rope. They let Gloria go first, for goodness sakes. I mean, it's a regular Badger love-in at this point, isn't it? And they sing about the glories of friendship. Tension is completely gone. And so we have a third conflict having to do with friendship, man versus man, resolved in a third place altogether. A deeper story than maybe you thought before this kind of conversation, right? The point I'm trying to make is that three separate conflicts are resolved at three separate moments. The line that we could draw between the climax of a plot and the conflict that it resolves could be drawn in three different places in this story with respect to the three different problems. And so the story has the complexity to support actual literary reading. Now, let me ask you this question before we close. You knew that all already, didn't you? You didn't need a 1 hour long literary discussion about A Bargain for Francis to know that the main theme of A Bargain for Francis is friendship. You should be nice to your fellow Badgers and don't be mean to them and manipulate them and steal their tea sets. But the point is not to learn the lesson of A Bargain for Francis. The point is to learn how to uncover the lesson or the theme of a work of literature, regardless of who it's written for, regardless of the author and the particular audience. I want to suggest to you that this process, noticing the structural elements, in this case of a plot and a climax and a conflict, and asking questions that force the students to identify those pieces and the way they relate to each other in a story, in the context of a discussion like this one, is the very best way to read any work of literature. And further, that if we start with easy books like this and continue this process as our students grow up with progressively, incrementally harder and harder books, when it's Shakespeare time and Dickens time and Dostoevsky time, they will be very well prepared indeed. Okay, that was really, really fast and super, super cursory. That is the guts and the gist of the Teaching the Classics approach to literary education. I'm at the end of my time, but I would love to answer questions if you have any. Does anybody have thoughts or reactions or questions? I think there is an official break now, so we're not horning in on anybody else's time. So if you have questions, I'd love to take them. Yes?
So most of our kids are middle school, and the thought that you have, would you suggest starting with, when you said that easier books like this and teaching them method?
Yeah, I'm glad you put it that way. I think really there's a need for us to emphasize method in the classroom rather than content specifically. And so I would say that. Let's take an easy book that's not intimidating for either one of you and let's emphasize method. And the reason, by the way, is that what we hope our kids will do is grow up and read. Well, first of all, you can't read them all. No matter how long you have your kids with you, you're going to have to be satisfied with some subset of the great books. So since you can't read them all, lean into that and say, you're going to read most of the good ones that I want you to read on your own. What I'm going to do instead is teach you how. And we're going to spend our time together focusing on method. So yes, my answer would be yes. Thank you for asking that. Good. Anybody else have a comment or a question? Yes.
There's one thing that seems to stand out to me. I'm wondering if I'm interpreting this correctly. I think of how Charlotte Mason talks about avoiding moralizing with our children, saying, so what this story is telling us is, and it seems that through the method of what you're doing is by asking them these questions, you're helping them to draw that out. It's really a guided narration in some ways, it seems to me, of what you'd be getting from the children is when you're asking them these questions, it's helping them to pull those out without us lecturing them more.
Yeah, I think so. I think in the idea of Charlotte Mason's moralizing concept is the idea of the teacher passing on his or her moral views to the student using the work of literature as an excuse.
Right.
What we want to do instead is have the student inquire of the work to find out what the author would say to him about whatever issues the author wants to talk about. Because when we open a novel, we're inviting the author to have his say in our minds and in our hearts. And so our job is to listen to him. Not necessarily to get what our mom or dad thinks about the world, although we need to get that too. But reading a novel is about getting the author's answers to those questions. And that's a distinct thing. And I think it's important to pay attention to that.
But I like how you're saying to bring out these specific questions to help them learn to engage with it.
Right.
In a systematic way.
Yep. What Rembrandt hoped is that all the people that saw his paintings would understand enough about painting to be able to see what he was doing. And what every author hopes is that his readers understand enough about how literature is put together that they can see what he's doing. And so understanding how literature is put together is step one. And we can do that right now because of Bargain for Francis. Yeah. Any other questions? They got me here all week. So come back and see me again. I'll be speaking again at 4 or 3 or whatever it is. And then also we have a table out in the atrium. So thanks for coming, everyone.